Welcome, everyone. Thank you. What a dream team to start my day. Thanks to all of you for kicking us off. Now, Miles, I've already given you an unfair introduction, set you up. There's nowhere to go but down. But having said that, as one of the great thinkers in this area, I want you to kick us off here. This dichotomy that's sometimes posited, that somehow pursuing carbon in the way that the great Klaus Lackner encouraged us, the way that you do. What do you respond to critics who say, surely this is a distraction or worse, greenwashing, this is undermining what we must do, which is to cut emissions? Give us your answer.
Well, what Klaus said was we're going to have to get rid of the CO2. He didn't say we're going to have to put it into the atmosphere first and then take it back out again. And I think that's a really important point that lots of people forget. What we need to do is dispose of carbon dioxide on a colossal scale. By 2100, we're going to have to dispose permanently, which right now means putting it back underground, of around 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide at a minimum. Right now, we put back underground 0.1% of the 40 billion tons we generate right now. So we haven't even started this process.
I mean, we can get lost in the numbers, but the point is, we put back a minuscule amount compared to the scale.
The big challenge is carbon dioxide disposal, and it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of how much of it should go into the atmosphere and then get taken back out again. We all should be focused on scaling up disposal of carbon dioxide as fast as possible, because we will stop climate change when and only when it is a licensing condition of taking fossil carbon out of the ground to put the CO2 it generates back into the ground. That is an answer to your claim that this is a wicked problem. It's not a wicked problem at all. It's a very simple problem. If you fix it that way, you don't have a book to write. Sorry about that, but it's the way it goes.
So that's an opening salvo, as expected. Thank you for rising to the challenge. Stefan, you are in the business of business. The professor has the luxury of sitting in an ivory tower telling us what's easy.
Oh, that's unfair.
This is trivial. Just make it so, people. Make it so. I'll come back in a few years and see how it's going. You are on the business end of it, and the technology end, the financing end. Is it as simple as the professor makes out in practice? And tell people just a little bit about what you're doing in this area so people know.
Okay, so Outokumpu is the largest stainless steel manufacturer. We are the largest one in Europe. And as probably most of you know, that 10% of the global CO2 emissions are coming from the steel industry. And am
I right that the name of the company means Strange Hill?
You made your homework, yes.
Yeah.
Outokumpu is a Finnish company. If you count the O's and the U's in the word, you might to see, yes, it must be somehow a Nordic name. Yes, it's a Finnish company. Which bought a couple of years ago a large German manufacturer, ThyssenKrupp stainless steel. A lot of people probably know that.
Sure.
And but I would like to come back to the question. I have big sympathy for making things easy. And I just would like to say, if you look at decarbonization technologies for operations for major industries, and I just said 10% of the global emissions are coming from the steel industry, the technology is there. There's no excuse that there's no technology to decarbonize the industry, but people are not doing it. We are not taking it serious, as you say. We take it for granted to take fossil fuels. We take it for granted to just put CO2 into the atmosphere and not caring for it. And I'm so proud that I can work for a company who take a different perspective on that, who put this as a value. And we are not we are not looking at profits, but on the other hand, we would like to make sure that we are reducing our carbon footprint continuously according to the theme of 1.5 degrees global warming maximization.
So let me press on this point. You are doing something, but you also, as you point out, lots of people are not working on this, though the technologies may be available. If I'm not mistaken, I think your sustainability report put the cost of CCS at something like 150 euros a ton, from your point of view. There are, of course, alternate technologies. There's people could look at DRI and the mini-mill approach, and Nucor has taken other approaches. But from your vantage point, that 150 euros a ton, roughly speaking, who's going to pay that? And
we
how
will-
are we going to make up the financing gap?
Yes.
What would it take for you to find the motivation, or your brethren, so that we do this?
The first question is, and this comes to the theme of this portion of this session here, how much is left to be stored, right? You need new technologies to avoid carbon generation on one hand, and you need to reduce your energy usage in order to reduce the carbon generation. And then at the end, it's a topic of storing or capturing and utilizing. And in my opinion, we will have to pay for it as a society. It will not be, I mean, if you take the steel industry again, hydrogen technology and so on, the taxpayers are paying for it.
Right. I mean, there's two pockets, right? We can pay as taxpayers or we pay as consumers,
Yes.
whether it's passed through B2B, B2B2C, ultimately. And so your point is it has to be paid, it has to be socialized one way or the other. It's not going to be industry that'll pay.
Right.
So let's put a pin in that. We'll come back to this. We have financing sections coming up later in the day. We'll dig into some of the details of this. Obviously, this is a high-level session, so I'm going to leave that there. Lamé, let's come to you. You have heard the setup thus far. Now, you have a very interesting vantage point in that though you have a long-standing expertise in these topics, you have a relatively new post at an interesting organization that may not be known to our audience. Can you tell us what the Crown Estate does and what position it puts you in to maybe advance some of these topics?
Thank you. Well, before I answer that question, I want to just check in the room how many people are actually emitters in the room, not technology providers, not carbon credit sellers, but you are an emitter. The first time. It's the first time I'm in a carbon conference that you have your customers in the room, so kudos to you and your team. So to answer the question, so I'm the director for Net Zero at the UK Crown Estate. And for those who don't know who the Crown Estate is, we're landowners in the UK. So we manage land in rural land, we manage buildings, and we manage the seabed.
You have a little bit of land.
A little bit of land. But the point is that we have holdings that are contributing to the UK, both from a net zero reduction perspective, but also energy security. And we lease the seabed for offshore wind, mining aggregates, linear assets, so pipelines and cables. We own, I think, half of the foreshore, if I get my numbers right. And that means that we also have infrastructure on the coast, so the ports, the marinas, wastewater and drainage, and all of those things. But with that eclectic portfolio of rural land, seabed, and built environment, carbon reduction is at the core of what we do. And so our role is to decarbonize our portfolio, but also then to contribute to the UK net zero overall. So as director of Net Zero, I kind of look after the enterprise portfolio from that perspective. And then one of the things we're looking at now from a carbon reduction perspective is what do we do with the holdings to contribute to that? And so we're looking at, so my colleague is in the audience. She's in charge of our CCUS projects and how we do that leasing for storage. But we're also looking at our rural holding. How do we leverage the regenerative agricultural piece, but also putting in some new technology around biochar, rock weathering, and how that can help with carbon removal. Because I think there is a misunderstanding in conversations around emissions reduction and removal. A lot of the mitigation plans right now is about reducing emissions today and in future, but we also have past emissions that we've got to deal with. And IPCC says we really have to take it out of the atmosphere and put it back in the ground. And that's where we're trying to contribute to the leadership and, drive that agenda.
That's really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. Of course, people in this room would know that the IPCC analysis suggests certainly in the second half of the century, it's not net zero. We need to go to negative emissions in order to make up for past sins, as it were, right?
Correct.
And so there's no doubt these technologies are necessary, but the framing of this session, however misguided it might be, does challenge, particularly you, if I may say so, because you have lands, you talked about your waterfront property and the water itself, as it were. And there must be a conversation in your organization or those who might challenge you saying, why not encourage emissions reductions or clean energy, windmills, and why are you doing all the CCS? The classic kind of tension that there is between reduction versus some of the activities that might be more innovative to deal with carbon removal. How do you address that, or is this an old conversation? You guys are well beyond it, and you don't have any challenges from
I
anyone.
mean, it comes back to the question is not either or, it's an and question, right? So we're leasing the seabed for generation of offshore wind, which will clean the energy system. But in order to roll out that scale of renewable energy is a lot of concrete and a lot of steel going into the seabed. And so we have a duty of care to ensure that that rollout is done in a sustainable way with as much carbon reduction, embodied carbon in that development. But then how do you protect the seabed from a biodiversity perspective? Because the seabed is busy, right? So it's the same seabed that you're going to have the offshore wind. We've got the mining aggregates. We've got the linear assets. So one of the things we've done is our marine development route map, which is taking the whole seabed as a kind of map, and then you're sectoring out parts of the seabed to make sure you're using the best part of the seabed for the best solution. So it's not an either or, because we will need to roll out more offshore wind, floating offshore wind, and all of that. But we also need to protect biodiversity. So you cannot, what's good for net zero may not be good for nature and people. And so where is that intersection coming together as a nexus to balance the delivery of both clean energy, but also delivering for people and nature?
Okay, so you're looking across the spectrum.
Yes.
Ryan, I want to come to you. You're a venture capitalist. You have an interesting background in tech, one of the pioneers in some of the thinking in Silicon Valley companies about advanced market commitments, thinking about carbon markets in a forward-looking way. But when you look at this challenge, you've described this to me and elsewhere as a mass transfer problem. Can you tell us what this means? And we have heard from Miles a little bit about some of the figures, right? The trillion figure was tossed out, and we can think about the stock or we can think about the flow. But tell us what you mean as a mass transfer problem, and how do you dimension it compared to other things that humans have done to, modify the earth, as it were, with our activities in the Anthropocene age in which we live?
Yeah. The way that we think about carbon removal and the way that a lot of the companies we work with think about carbon removal, for context, we're early stage investors in all forms of emissions reduction, carbon removal, and then sort of climate adaptation or buying more time approaches. And on the carbon removal side, the way we kind of think about it is that doing carbon removal at large scale is going to look a lot like what society looks like when it's emitting, right? We're going to be moving around liquids, solids, gases, rocks, plants, the same way that we do when we emit, right? Like emitting is not just from just natural gas being burned and emitting CO2, right? We're moving coal around. We're moving all sorts of organic materials around that are emitting methane. We're moving all sorts of mineral and mining products around. We're moving ships all over the ocean. And all of this, we're moving material around, right? And anything we're emitting, the fact that we can emit 50 gigatons a year of CO2 equivalent is pretty incredible, actually. That's so much stuff. If anyone has been, we were just talking about this, but go to West Texas and just look at the scale of these facilities. It's so cool. And the thing about it is that if we're going to do carbon removal at significant scale, it looks like moving on the order of the amount of material that we emit, right? So the coal industry, for example, because you'll speak to this, the coal industry moves about 8 gigatons a year of coal these days. It used to be more, but we've fortunately reduced our coal use significantly in many parts of the world. And to take 8 gigatons of coal out of the ground, it's not just 8 gigatons on the surface, right? We mined that stuff 100 years ago. There's overburden and there's tailings and there's all this material on top of the coal. So to take 8 gigatons of coal out of the ground, you're moving 30 gigatons of stuff. And if we took 8 gigatons of basalt, for example, for enhanced rock weathering, we have trains to move 8 gigatons of rocks around. They go to and from the coal mines. We've already built all this stuff out. And you want to use the existing depreciated infrastructure and the existing CapEx that we've built since the Industrial Revolution to move around your biomass and your rocks and your CO2 for carbon removal. Because the thing we've been doing as we've been learning how to emit is we've been learning how to move these materials around for cheap. And carbon removal looks like leveraging those same networks, whether it's enhanced rock weathering or carbon removal in mine tailings, or whether it's gas transport for direct air capture and underground injection, or whether it is moving biomass on trains and bulk carriers for solutions that are making biochar or bio-oil. It's all the same infrastructure, and it's really about running it in reverse instead of building something new from scratch.
The volumes that you're talking about are massive.
Yeah.
I mean, you gave coal as an analogy. Humans have done this for a long time. But at the same time, is there some dimension of shifting emissions around? I think there was a Princeton study that suggested that crushing rock for enhanced weathering requires 500 to 700 kilowatt hours per ton of CO2 removed. I mean, the specific number doesn't matter. We can quibble with that. But the idea that somehow you're shifting the emissions and energy from one part of the ledger to another, do you worry about that? That in coal-heavy grids, for example, that in fact you may end up creating new problems?
I mean, we definitely worry about that in a broad sense, right? Like one of the key approaches in carbon removal right now is centered around sophisticated life cycle analysis, understanding the monitoring and verification requirements of these things. And the thing about that though is that it prices, when done correctly, and when like the analysis of the carbon removal systems is done correctly, it prices that in really well, right? Because like the carbon intensity of the energy that you use, or the carbon intensity of the transport that you use, everything that goes into making that ton of carbon removal should and does get netted out, right? And then you are forced to
But that's
decide.
in a system that has externalities pricing, right? That's the precondition to that comment.
No, I mean,
Otherwise,
this
you
is
could-
literally how carbon
you could have
removal
carbon dumping
credits-
equivalents in your world.
No, I mean, like, this is literally how the removal credits work today, right? Because people are buying a net ton, right? Is what everyone wants and what everyone's buying. And if your carbon intensity, this is true in direct air capture, right? Like you net out the amount, the carbon intensity of the energy used when you're producing and selling like a net ton, right? So what it forces suppliers of carbon removal to do, as it should, is decide, oh, should they site on a dirtier grid, but spend more time developing the efficiency of their technology so that they can make up for it? Or can they go run a less efficient energetic process, but they have to go find a really clean grid to do it? And that is the sort of analysis you want them to make. And specifically on the rock grinding, it's like, yeah, it is the energy intensity that it is, right? Depending on the hardness of the mineral. But also we have like 100 years worth of ground up rock in big piles that we could start with and use, right? There's a company that's doing carbon removal on active mine tailings in Western Australia, a company called Arca. And there's a nickel mine in Western Australia with the capacity to do like tens of megatons of carbon removal on this single site, if not more. And that's a pile of rocks that's like 70 years old, right? So like you could do a lot before you have to start grinding up new rocks.
Okay. So you see this, especially if we do the MRV right, if we do the metrics right, the
Yeah.
transparency, we can get legitimate credits. Now, I know credits is something you think about. Sparsh, coming to you. But first, maybe, I know you have Alt Carbon as a carbon initiative, but I think people would be really interested to know the context of the company you come from, what do you do, and how you got into this. Tell us about what you do in Darjeeling.
Sure.
Spill the tea, if I may say so.
Thanks so much, Vijay. My name is Sparsh. I'm a fourth generation tea planter. My family's been in the tea plantation business for about 3 generations now. We don't have as much land as Lame does. But however, we are one of the oldest.
Who does?
No, who does? We do manage about 5,000 acres of land in Darjeeling, in North Bengal, and the Northeast. And the context that I come from is that I have nothing to do with carbon science. I studied political philosophy, and then I went off to study international climate law. But my younger brother, he studied chemistry and mechanical engineering. And our family's tea estates in Darjeeling, they were on the verge of bankruptcy and collapse in 2020 because of the pandemic, but because there were other tailwinds related to market-linked reasons and climate change. Market-linked specifically, that only 1 in 5 cups of Darjeeling tea come from the estates of Darjeeling, even though there are only 87 historic estates. And climate change, obviously, our yield was going down because of changing weather patterns, reducing our crop yield, reducing our harvest period, etc. So we were looking at whether carbon markets can provide our family's tea estates supplementary source of income, thereby transforming these really large estates from being at risk of climate change impact to becoming the frontier of climate action. And from 2020 onwards, I spent a lot of time looking at a number of different carbon market solutions, NBS, RED+, ARR, a lot of the junk, frankly, crap quality avoidance credits, because of which
That's a
we
technical term, by the way.
Yeah.
That don't know it.
I mean, and there's a reason why we have Greenpeace right outside. There's a reason why they were protesting against that. So we realized that if we actually want to do something in the carbon market space, we should focus on durable engineered carbon removal. And what we focused on was a technology called enhanced rock weathering, which very simply means that the science behind it is that as rain falls on mountains, the CO2 in the rainwater interacts with the silicates sits on the rocks on the mountains, and it breaks down the CO2 into bicarbonates, which is a very stable way of storing carbon. And these bicarbonates are then transported through river networks to the ocean, where they become corals and seashells. How do you accelerate that from 1,000 years in a geological time scale to a few months? We do that by taking volcanic rock dust, transporting them to our family's tea estate, spreading it on soil, and because the surface area is higher of the volcanic rock dust, it accelerates the process, and that's how we remove carbon. Now, the science is notoriously difficult, and that's what we've cracked. So that's a bit about what I do. I hope that gives some context.
That's great. Thank you.
Excuse me, Vijay, can I
Yes,
just
please.
break some myths as well? Because I think everyone thinks decarbonization and energy transition is going to be low intensity. It's going to be very high energy consuming across board, across sectors. So I think it's important that and that word versus is not the right, it's an and. So we have to do carbon removal and we also have to do emissions reduction. But if we don't start the carbon removals today, we do not have the track record and the data points to actually prove or disprove whether they work. And this is where we are now at 2025, 5 years to 2030, and we haven't scaled up any of these technologies. CCUS has been around for a very long time. I grew up in oil and gas, and so it's not a new technology. The amount of time that bankers say it's not bankable because it's a new technology, you kind of have an allergic reaction to that statement because it's not.
Yeah.
We know how to do these things. It's not an ability problem that we have worldwide. It's just a lack of willingness and the funding. So maybe Ryan can put some money, behind some of these things. Customers in the room, talk to Ryan.
Exactly. So I'm going to come to the audience in a few minutes. We'll have a bit of a round robin first, but I want to ask you to get your thoughts together, get one or two sharp questions for our panelists. Miles, I want to come to you because you've obviously followed this for a long time. Picking up on Lame's point, CCUS is not new. I can remember 20 years ago, a report from the International Energy Agency that I wrote up in The Economist saying there's some very promising projects in CCUS. This is very important for the future. It was already clear at that time, climate change is an issue. This could be a social license to operate for the industry. BP had a project in, I think it was Algeria, North Africa, if I'm not mistaken. Oregon came on with Chevron later on. What went wrong? How did the wheels go off the bus on this?
It's because we talked about social license to operate rather than just license to operate. That would have been the solution. Now, the problem is, and if I may disagree with one of the things you said, which is the taxpayer has to pay for this. No, it doesn't. The customer who wants to use fossil fuels needs ultimately to pay for the disposal of the CO2 those fossil fuels generate. Whether it's the same CO2 or somebody else's CO2, I don't care. But it's got to go back underground. There may be other ways of disposing of it permanently. So maybe through remineralization, it'll end up in the oceans permanently. But it's got to be disposed of on multi-thousand-year timescales. Yes. If you're generating CO2 from a multi-thousand-year source, that's the sort of like-for-like balance that we need to.
But let me press you on this. Your point that the customer has to pay. The question I asked you was, why hasn't this happened? This has been around, promoted 20 years ago as very important. And you're saying, not only did it not happen, but people have to pay more. One thing I know about people, how many of you want to pay more for fossil fuels or any other thing? How many of you are in favor of price increases? Fantastic. There's 3 people. They'll come along. And so you've given us a new formula for it not happening for the next 20 years. So surely there's a contradiction in your argument here.
What we pay for fossil fuels in Europe would be enough to pay for CO2 disposal, okay, compared to what they actually cost to deliver. Okay. But
tell us one more sentence on this, because that may not immediately be apparent to people. What do you mean by this?
Well,
are you talking about taxes and fiscal regime?
Let me put it this way. The difference between what we pay for fossil fuels in Europe and what they pay for fossil fuels in the US would be enough to pay for CO2 disposal.
I see.
Okay?
Right.
So
this is because European taxation, basically.
So most of that's taxes,
right.
Some of it's additional profit, and so on. So the point is, people are willing to pay enough for fossil fuels to get rid of the CO2.
I see.
Unfortunately, there's no requirement to do so. So therefore, the money doesn't go on to getting rid of the CO2. It goes on to either taxes or somebody's profit or whatever. So, I think what people need to come to accept, and this is where, we're mentioning Greenpeace perhaps slightly too often, but this is what our friends in the environmental movement need to get their minds around, is people want to use fossil fuels and are willing to pay the cost of CO2 disposal. They're just not required to. That's the problem. And if we thought of this problem in a different way, as a waste disposal one, that as soon as it comes out of the ground, you've created an obligation to get rid of that CO2 permanently, then I think ultimately, I predict we won't solve the problem until we think of it that way.
Right.
But it's going to take, tragically, it's taking a very long time to get people to think about it in that way.
That is a provocative point. I could quarrel with you on this, but maybe we'll do it over drinks at the end of the conference. But let me take you at your word and this idea that this is a waste management problem, because that is one of the ideas that people put forward that, for example, when Exxon launched its low carbon division a couple of years ago, one of the arguments from Wall Street analysts was they're getting into something like a waste management business. There was a time a few centuries ago when people in medieval cities would just dump their rubbish out their window, right? When you happen to be walking by below, bad luck for you. And obviously that is not tolerated and certainly in developed markets. We have companies, waste management is one in the US. We have municipal operators in many places. Any of you who watch The Sopranos will know that New Jersey has fantastic waste management companies that are affiliated with a powerful Italian-American organization. And so if we see carbon management in that manner, it might become a normal industry, probably with relatively low margins, maybe in decentralized fashion. But there is an alternative thesis that, in fact, we should see this really as a commodity business. And if we see this, and that the great traders of commodities may see this as the opportunity, that's the direction one might think we're going with voluntary carbon markets, maybe ultimately compliance and mandatory markets. Ryan, you're a finance guy on this panel. What do you think about this ideological challenge posed by commodities, and which could be quite volatile, prices going up and down, versus maybe a more stable utility model of waste management? Where do you see carbon going?
I think those are both really interesting frames. Actually, the thing with, I think from a societal perspective and like the effect that it, in a world where like maybe the simplest way to put this is like to the effect that it like is an actual public good, which it is, right? In the same way that waste management and having clean water and having like a clean environment is like a genuine public good. I think the waste management analogy is correct. I think the business models will look similar, right? Like waste management, the trash pickup on the side of the street in front of your house is typically like low or negative margin as like a loss leader. And then they do like make reasonable margins on running the landfills, right? And like, I think that kind of dynamic will be true of many carbon removal businesses. The reason that the commodity type folks are interested is not like a geophysical thing. It is entirely a statement about the regulatory regimes and mostly trying to like arbitrage or hedge regulatory risks that are different in different places, right? So like the way that the commodity people think about it is that if you, and I'm not a commodity person, but in the world where like the carbon intensity of a thing is valued or penalized differently in different places, right? Whether in different trading regimes or different countries or even different states like in the US, right? Carbon removal and these sorts of things can help to like hedge and balance the risk of that, right? And it's in a more like abstracted trade context. And this is in the way that, futures and other things like that are used generally, right? And I think they're sort of both true, but like not contradictory to each other. And it just depends on the regulatory scheme.
Egg each other on. A quick point before I come to the audience, and I want to see hands. Who wants to jump in? Please get ready with your hands. We'll come to you in a minute. Let's get the microphone runners ready. Yeah.
Yeah. So just on the finance question, a couple of points that are important to make up is, we've spoken a lot about removal versus reduction and reduction, right? There is a cost associated with removals, right? I was at the National Museum the other day and someone pointed out in one of the paintings the symbolism behind pepper that was there. And I believe that the term is pepper expensive, right? Removal is supposed to be expensive. Removal needs to be expensive for there to be incentives for people to reduce as well. And for high quality removal to take place from the atmosphere, you need to be able to pay money for it. I mean, we are already the cheapest in the world when we do it at like less than $300. But someone has to pay that money. And that comes to the question of finance, because I think that that's something that we haven't really spoken about. Carbon markets are a unique charter. A carbon credit is a unique charter which marries together scientific rigor, climate finance through a global justice perspective, and social co-benefits, right? You need to be able to bring all three of those things together, and you need to be able to move the climate finance from developed countries to developing countries. I come from India. we have only emitted 3% of global historic emissions. But can we make a place like India the carbon removal hub, thereby actually mobilizing climate finance and adapting stuff like agriculture or marine environments for removal? I think that becomes a question that gets lost in the debate about whether it's removal or emissions. It has to be both, but what kind of removal that we prioritize basis the kind of structural economy that we have in line with the kind of moral and philosophical principles that matter to us, that is the real second-degree question that we need to start getting to, that gets lost in our discussion today, I feel.
That's a powerful point. I'm going to let that be the last word from the stage for the moment. I see, do we have a question here? Do we have some speakers? Let's see some hands. So I know we have one over here. Fine, let's start over here. Just a couple of ground rules. Please identify yourself, your name and affiliation, and let's make it an interesting question. Nobody likes a gas bag giving a long-winded speech from the floor.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it short. Harry McKay, Lanxess and Chemical Industry. Maybe a question for Miles. So the delta between price of oil in Europe and price of oil in the US would cover carbon removal. Based on what range of technologies? Because there's a broad range of technologies at very different costs. Just curious about that. Thank you.
Sorry, price of petrol.
The product.
Yeah, does it important? Shall I answer straight away?
Sure.
Yeah.
Just give it. Yeah.
So $250 a ton, which at scale is sort of a reasonable number for direct air capture costs, translates to 60 pence a litre, which I believe is roughly the addition that I pay when I fill my car. It's a plug-in hybrid, but we do fill occasionally, relative to what my friends in the US pay. So that money goes mostly to the UK taxpayer, to the UK Treasury, who claims they're concerned about climate change. If they would spend that money on getting rid of that CO2, the UK could be net zero tomorrow. And yet, that's nowhere on the agenda. Why not? Instead, we're going to spend a fortune on electrifying transport and electrifying our home heating system. How does that make any sense?
So you have an answer. Now, I still have a quibble with you because what you're really saying is that the only organization or group that dislikes paying more than us in this room, that is end consumers, is the government itself, right? You're asking them to redirect the resources that they're now using, all this petrol revenues for other fiscal purposes, all to carbon capture and sequestration.
They're giving it up.
It ain't going to
anyway.
happen.
They're giving it
Or
up
they have to
anyway
raise
because
it.
they say we're going to stop.
But that's
using
okay.
fossil fuels,
I
so
love
they
a good
won't
thought
have the fossil
exercise.
fuel taxes.
Let's move. Let's go to this lady here in red, and then we'll come to the gentleman near you. We'll take one question, then the other. And shorter questions, shorter answers, please.
Therese Batiste from Bactalis, based in Belgium. As a former ambassador, UN ambassador, and former politician, I'm thinking, I heard you talk about US and Europe. I was so glad when Sparsh mentioned India, because again...
You're going to make it a question, though, right?
Yeah, I'm going to make a question.
Diplomats make me very nervous.
You all are forgetting the social impact, and we need to look at social impact in everything we do, and we are not doing that. We're just coming up with laws and reasons, and there's no infrastructure in emerging economies to do these things that you all want us to do. And then we get said, oh, you're not doing anything. And when I say emerging economies, I come from Trinidad and Tobago. We produce oil, yes. We also do cement, yes. But we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the pipelines. We don't have the storage facilities. And politicians can be very corrupt. That's why I'm no longer a politician.
Okay.
So the people suffer. So what are you all proposing for emerging economies?
Important question.
Can I go?
Yeah,
Because I'm
please, Samantha.
Nigerian,
Yeah.
so I can speak to, we also oil reserves and gas reserves. And so for me, I think energy transition and decarbonization has to look different by geography, by sector, and by region. So from my African perspective, it's actually easier to move women to clean cooking than for us to be talking about CCUS or hydrogen economy. It's really a distraction. So let's give women clean cooking, clean water. Let's start there. That is a transition. And then for those economies that are beyond, the hierarchy of needs, then they can invest in the Lamborghini solution of carbon removal. But there are social impacts. 600 million people in Africa have zero access to energy. And so you want them to do hydrogen? Seriously? So there is that conversation that gets missing. But nevertheless, we've got to do both. We've got to remove and we've got to reduce emissions. It's not an either or, it's an and.
Yeah, that's a powerful point. Let's go to the next question here, the gentleman.
Yes, hi. I'm Niput Kaushik from Capgemini Engineering, Netherlands. And the main question, and this might fuel the debate between Miles and Vijay, but to what extent, because that whole debate around, emissions and reduction, emissions and removal, doesn't it make a lot of sense to focus on specifically the energy production side before we move to CO2 capture, since there is a large element of energy production that is still used in carbon capture? Unless the energy that we've produced is completely CO2 neutral, it doesn't make sense to power carbon capture units that are using carbon intense energy to capture carbon. It's sort of that's the chicken and egg
No
problem
one's
that
really
I-
doing that.
Okay. Someone have an answer to this? Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
I'll give an example just to, I think that what Ryan also touched upon was, so take the example of removal, right? In enhanced rock weathering, we do transport volcanic rock dust from point A to point B. It's through railway freight, right? So there is a certain amount of emissions that goes into that. But you do have something called the life cycle assessment. So for example, in April, when we deliver our first credits, if we have removed X amount of carbon from the atmosphere, we are also subtracting Y amount of emissions that have gone into actually removing that emissions. And the economics only makes sense when Y as a percentage is a very small fraction. In our case, it's sub of 10%. So we actually do remove that. I mean, none of this makes sense if to remove 10 tons, you're actually emitting 12 tons. So I don't think that anyone is really doing that. Even for the carbon capture technologies, it only makes sense when even at point source or when you're actually removing it and storing it, overall you're removing more than you're actually emitting.
Yeah, your point is very well taken, though, that life cycle analysis matters. And there are people who look at this, of course, and it's so transparent in the sense that you can tell the energy in what the sources of energy are. If it's going to be fossil inputs that are unabated, you can easily account for those. For example, in that Occidental example, Oxy, I'm not here to trumpet Oxy, but just to point out a leading example, the company's also invested in a company called Net Power that makes electricity from natural gas without the carbon emissions. It's one of the big investors in that, as an example. Or there's oil field electrification that Equinor and others are doing as well, ADNOC is doing. So you are seeing ways of addressing the input energy that deal with some of the methane and CO2 emissions. But we need to be vigilant about this because you're absolutely right. It wouldn't make
Sorry,
sense.
can I just
I want to go to our next question, but a quick point.
Just
Yeah.
in terms of the energy source and use, so if you look at the Climeworks project in Iceland, the DAC is being powered by geothermal. So there are ways, there is no way
That's
we
right.
can decarbonize without energy intensity and energy use.
That's right. But it's a
impossible.
very
It's a
important
myth.
point. Absolutely.
Carbon removal
Let's-
developers
let's,
are a really great thing to have on the grid, right? Because like if you want the grid to be greener, your best customer is someone who the carbon intensity of the grid directly affects their margin, like with no steps in between. So you want more demand from carbon removal on the grid because those are the people that actually care about the carbon intensity. It's more abstracted everywhere else.
Let's come here. We just have a couple of minutes. So quick question, quick answers, please.
Hello, good morning. My name is Juho Lipponen and I'm with the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS. My question is to Stefan. Implementing CCUS on steel will obviously have a cost. Somebody mentioned 150 per ton. That has a cost on the impact on the cost of steel. But then the further you go in the chain, it has a lesser and lesser impact on the cost of a bridge or a building or an apartment in a building, for example. So what are your thoughts about creating incentives for the end customer to buy clean product that will incentivize you to implement carbon capture on your plants?
I think that's a very, very good question. Overall, the demand from the end consumer will get higher regarding greener materials. It's about, first of all, it's about education of the consumer, that you can take the best decision, that you can take the greener steel compared to the traditional steel. That's one part. And then the second part is, I believe that there needs to be a leveled playing field on the comparison across the globe on the steel manufacturing. If you compare, for example, the steel that is generated in Europe compared to the steel that is generated in Asia, especially in Indonesia and in China, there's a factor of 8 to 9 how much more CO2 is generated per ton.
Sure.
8 to 9.
This is what CBAM looks to address, if I'm not mistaken, the European mechanism. However problematic it is, and the details will be worked out, but this is the conceptual point of carbon dumping. Am I right? So the U.S., I predict, may even introduce a CBAM in the next 12 months. There's conservative Republican support for some kind of cross-border carbon measure, and including longstanding Democratic support. But I predict it'll happen if they change the acronym from the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure to the China Bashing Action Measure. You call it that, it'll pass the U.S. Senate immediately. That's my prediction for the day. We are out of time. Please give a nice round of applause for my wonderful panelists. Thank you very much. I invite you to leave the stage.
Thanks, Vijay.
Great to see you. Thank you.